Welcome to the shop. Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's video I'm going to be fabricating one of the iconic blasters from the Clone Wars series, the DC-17. Now, ever since The Mandalorian has wrapped up, I've been watching a ton of the Clone Wars in my shop, and I'm very excited about the Bad Batch coming out, so I figured it's about time that I made my own DC-17 blaster pistol. Now, this is made almost completely out of my HD foam, which you of course can find over at Blick Art Materials, which means that it's very, very lightweight. Only a few pieces of PVC in here, just for the barrel and the back of the pistol. Now, this is a pretty simplistic build, but sometimes that's not always the easiest thing to do because you can't add your additional battle damage when you mess up. Now, in this video, I'm going to go over the basic techniques that I use to put this together, as well as some advanced ones. I go over my use of the bandsaw and the belt sander, and if you're a foam smith and you do this a lot, those are two tools that I would really recommend to look into. So let's go ahead and jump into the build process. There's a link in the description section that goes directly to my website, so you can download this PDF of the DC-17 and build right along with me. The first thing I do is cut out this blueprint and separate the top from the bottom. I'm going to work on the top half first. To make the barrel and the back of this blaster, I'm going to be using a 3/4 inch PVC pipe. Now, my initial thought was to have this pipe run through the gun for stability, but I ended up changing that later on. This pipe was cut out on the bandsaw, and then I sanded the outside of the pipe as well as the cut with a sanding sponge. This will get rid of all the markings and make the pipe better for paint application. So now that I've got my barrel, I can start working on the main body. This blueprint is then rough transferred onto some 10mm HD foam 3 times. These 3 cutouts will all be sandwiched together to give me the correct thickness for the body. To glue all the foam together, I'm going to be using weldwood contact cement. I go ahead and put an X on the interior of all these pieces, so I put adhesive on the correct side. Now, weldwood contact cement is a little bit thinner than barge, so I usually end up doing 2 coats. And one way you can speed up the dry time is to lightly hit it with a heat gun, but not too much because you can end up destroying the bond process. And you guys know how much I love my double adhesive method, so I go ahead and put some Bob Smith super glue where the body of the gun is going to be. These first 2 foam pieces are placed on top of each other, and then I use the barrel that I cut as a rolling pin to make sure that they are firmly sandwiched together. Once these 2 pieces have set up, I can add adhesive to the 3rd piece and use my rolling pin technique again to make sure that they're all firmly pressed together. Now that I've got my HD block of foam, I can go ahead and transfer the main body of the blaster onto the top using a pencil. Once I have the general shape, I go ahead and use a metal straight edge to make sure that all my lines are perfect. Now at this point, I'm just going to cut away the bottom and the front right corners so I can add the templates to it for the next step. Now you of course could cut this part out by hand, but this is where investing in a bandsaw could make a huge difference in your overall cut quality and your time. So now that my block of foam is cut, I'm going to grab some 2mm HD foam and transfer my body template to this 2 more times. You can see how this 2mm piece lines up with the bottom right corner, but I need to remove this slot from the side to give it a recessed look. This foam can easily be removed using a scalpel blade and a metal straight edge. Contact cement is once again used for the main section of this body, but not where this recess is going to be. Around this cut, I'm going to be using some Bob Smith super glue so this build stays really clean. Now it's just as simple as lining up the lower right corner for either side and then applying some Bob Smith super glue along the perimeter. I can then take my rolling pin barrel and make sure that all these pieces are once again pressed together firmly. Once the adhesives have cured, I can take this over to my bandsaw and cut away all the additional foam. A bandsaw is not a necessity, it just helps me speed up my work time and gives me amazingly clean cuts. Now that my block of foam is the correct depth, I can go ahead and cut out this side detail on the side of the blueprint. This is drawn onto the foam to ensure that I place these strips exactly where they need to go. These strips will glue onto the sides of the barrel, so let's go ahead and attach that. I start off by pressing the PVC pipe into the foam to leave an impression. Then using a 1-inch Forstner bit, I remove enough material that there's a shallow depth that the pipe can sit in. Now that the hole has been drilled, I can go back to my template and determine exactly how much of the barrel needs to protrude. The pipe is trimmed away on the bandsaw, and then Bob Smith super glue is used to tack it into place. The side strips are cut from some 10mm HD foam. Now they need to be beveled a little bit on the top to conform to the shape of the barrel. Once I determine the fit is all good, they can be glued to the sides following the lines that I had drawn on earlier. Now you notice with my strips, they wrap around the front great, but there's a little bit of a gap. That's no problem because I'm going to fill this later on with some foam clay. The trigger guard piece is cut away from the template and I line it up just to make sure that all of it's coming together properly. This piece is then traced onto some 10mm HD foam and also cut out on my bandsaw. To cut out the trigger section, I start off by drilling a small hole in the middle. I'm going to be using a small sanding drum attached to my Dremel flex shaft to remove as much material as possible. I transfer the template to both sides of this piece because you kind of only get one shot at this, but if you mess up, it's just foam. Cut another one and go at it again. When I get to the process where I just slightly need to refine it, I switch over to a stone bit. This allows me to smooth over a lot of the tiny imperfections with a lot of control. Once complete, the trigger guard can be glued into place, and it's as simple as lining it up with the middle of the foam block. Now, a lot of different makers have made this particular blaster over the years, but there's always one detail that seems to be in question, and that is the grip. A lot of the different makers make the grip too big. I went back through a bunch of the different episodes and I freeze framed, and it looks like the grip is supposed to be pretty small. The pinky actually rests on this lower piece. Now, if your hand is a little bit bigger than mine, or if you want to scale it up, that's no problem at all. Again, this is just cosplay. It's a foam blaster. Just have fun with the build process. Now that the top of the blaster has been pretty much figured out, it's time to move on to the handle. To get the correct thickness, this template will also be traced onto foam that has been stacked up. In this case, contact cement is applied to 2 pieces of 10mm HD foam, and this should be perfect for the size. The rolling pin technique is once again used. The template is transferred onto the HD foam with a pencil, and the bandsaw makes easy work of cutting out the handle. Now, because this is a stress point for the prop, I'm going to be using the double adhesive method again, putting contact cement in the middle and Bob Smith superglue along the perimeter. Once attached, you can see there's a small gap between the handle and the trigger guard. The template for this is transferred onto some 4mm HD foam. The front of this is contoured just a little bit with a sanding drum, and you can see it fits right into place. To fabricate the block at the end of the handle, I'm going to be using some of the leftover 10mm HD foam that was stacked 3 times for the body. To get the correct angles, this piece was first cut on the bandsaw and then blocked out on the belt sander. And as you can see, it's slightly wider than the handle itself. This piece has angled contours on the top and the bottom that are lightly marked on the sides with a pencil, and then I carefully use my belt sander to remove enough material to get the correct shape. This process could also be done with a medium grit sanding drum. To get rid of some of the extra foam fuzzies caused by the belt sander, a heat gun is used to seal the foam off, and now it can be glued onto the bottom of the handle using some Bob Smith superglue. To replicate the piece at the back of the blaster, I used the same process that I'd used to attach the barrel, starting off by pressing into the foam and then using a Forstner bit to remove some of the material. Now, this piece doesn't stick out very far, but I want some of it to go into this little circle at the back. The bandsaw is used to cut the PVC pipe down, and the sanding sponge is used to rough up the surface. Now this can be glued into place. From my template, I determined that the circle on the back is about 1.75 inches in diameter, so I break out my circle jig that I created for my bandsaw and set it to the correct size. Using some 6mm HD foam, this jig allows me to create perfect circles from any size up to 10 inches in diameter. If you want to learn how to build one of these circle jigs, check out the video on my channel. Now, the tack on the jig left a mark directly in the middle of the circle, so I know exactly where I need to remove the material. So I once again use my Forstner bit just to rough up the foam a little bit, plus this lets me know exactly where the pipe needs to be glued. For the detail lines on the back, I start by removing them from the template and placing this onto the body of the blaster. Here I can mark out exactly where they need to go, so there's no room for me to guess. The size of these strips is traced onto some 6mm HD foam and cut out with a utility blade. Now, with all my strips cut, I can use the template as a guide for the angle. This angle is drawn onto several of the pieces, and I use a ruler to connect the lines. This line can then be cut with a utility blade, and this makes sure that all my angles on all my lines is exactly the same. And if you notice, I cut out a few more than I need just in case. These detail strips can now be glued to the side of the gun, and because I had marked exactly where they need to go, there's no room for error. The same process can be done to the opposite side, and it's funny how a couple little lines like this can give it that iconic look. On the trigger guard, there's a detail indentation right near the front. Using my template, the middle of this is marked on either side with a pencil. To make this mark, I'm going to be using my hot tool with a round bit on the end. I go ahead and set it to the highest temperature. Now, it doesn't take any force at all for this to burn into the foam, and this would be a bad time to mess it up. Also, if you notice, there are some fumes coming off of this, so you want to always make sure to be wearing your respirator. With most of the fabrication complete, I go ahead and use my smooth sanding drum to knock down all the hard edges all over the blaster. Once complete, a light heat treatment can be used to help seal off the foam. With most of the gun now complete, I can start working on the trigger, which was transferred onto some 6mm HD foam. Now this was rough cut with a utility knife and glued into place. Most of the refinement on this was done with a rotary tool. So after the trigger was put in there, I marked on it the curve that I wanted and then removed all the excess material with a small sanding drum. Now there's a slight lip to the trigger, and I fabricated this using some 2mm HD foam. Using scissors, I cut small bevels on the top and the bottom so that it would sit a little more flush, and then glued this into place. So remember earlier when I was making the side pieces and I had some small gaps? Now it's time to fill those using some foam clay. I go ahead and wet the surface and the barrel with a little bit of water and then press the foam clay down into the joint. Here I can use various sculpting tools or silicone tip tools to get the size and shape that I need. Now this process doesn't have to be perfect because after it dries you can go back and sand it smooth. So I come back the next day, which is a little bit less than 24 hours, but the foam clay has set up well enough that it can be sanded. So I break out some sanding sticks and refine the foam clay to the size and shape that I want. To seal my foam off, I'm going to be using the FX brand Clear Primer. Depending on your application, this will give you a decent base and not give you any additional textures like Plasti-Dip. This primer is applied with a large flat brush on large areas and a smaller filbert brush on the smaller details. This will help minimize brush strokes. Once the blaster is covered, a hairdryer is used to speed up the dry time. Now this technique is going to be a little bit different than what I typically do. I'm going to wet sand the foam in the primer. Because this primer is a water-based product, doing a wet sand like this gives it an extremely smooth surface. Now this isn't going to leave the foam completely seamless, but it does a pretty darn good job. After the brush-on primer had dried, I did a light dusting of Krylon Black Primer. Liquitex Mars Black is going to make up the predominant base for this build, but then I go back in with a paper towel and blotch to give the surface a different texture and sheen. I want to take a moment to thank all of my Patreon supporters and those of you that have been purchasing my line of HD foam through Blick Art Materials. Now remember to go through the links that are in the description section or those that are on my website because I do receive a small vendor affiliate and that allows me to continue to build awesome things and show you how to do it. So once again, thank you all for your continued support. It's very subtle, but this helps break up the look of the surface and the lines from the foam seams. Now here's something I usually don't do, but I'm going to be using a Valspar flat acrylic spray to seal my paint and give it an additional texture. This is going to help the graphite powder adhere a little better. And after mentioning that graphite powder, it's applied with a shop rag to all the exposed and highlight surfaces on the blaster. This is a really simple way to give the DC-17 a metallic sheen. Now graphite powder can get pretty messy, so make sure you do this on a covered surface. And here's where I messed up. While looking over at my reference images, I noticed that I left off the sight at the top of the blaster. So as you can tell, I'm not perfect. I don't know how I did this, but I went ahead and pulled the template out of the trash can, and sure enough, there's the top of the sight still left on there. So I went ahead and cut off that part of the template and transfer that onto some 10mm HD foam. Now I'm going to have to go through all the painting steps that I did on the gun already for this particular piece so that it matches properly. Now that includes sanding it, priming it, hitting it with the rattle can and the clear coat, and our piece is back to normal. To attach this sight piece, I put some slits into the top of the blaster just to help with adhesion, and then super glue is used to attach it to the top. Alright, so where was I before I realized that I didn't have an integral part to the blaster attached? Oh yeah, I was adding graphite powder. So the graphite powder is added to this new piece so it can match the rest of the pistol. Now to give parts of this blaster an exposed metal or chip look, I'm going to be using Liquitex Heavy Body Bright Silver. This paint is applied by using the side of a very small flat brush. Now this technique isn't something you want all over the place, I just kind of hit it here and there and actually use my fingers to smooth it out. Basically this is just applied to the edges that would receive the most wear and tear. Now I know what you're thinking, it looks really bright and there's a lot of contrast to that that's not necessarily in the Clone Wars series. And that's okay, because we're going to actually dull this down by putting a layer of graphite back on top. What that'll do is the paint will still show through as that exposed metal, but the graphite will dull it down just a little bit. Now the graphite is pretty bright, and I want to tone it down just a little bit. So I go back with the Valspar clear coat, and this will darken up the graphite. And then I go back in with just a little bit more graphite on the outside edges. As you know, with most of my props, it's all about the layers, and adding all these different layers to it is what gives these props a realistic and authentic look. So you guys can see the basic steps that I took to put together my own DC-17. And what's great, again, free blueprints are available over on my website, so go over in the description section, click on that link, download them, and build right along with me. Now, hopefully you guys are enjoying these videos. If you are, give them a thumbs up, share them with your friends and family. And remember, if you're building any of my builds or using HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKSProps on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creation. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD foam.